Ladies and gentlemen, good evening if you are hearing us from Europe, and good morning to the people who are all across the American continent. Welcome to this webinar. Also welcome if you are listening to this at a later moment and you have downloaded the recordings. The title of today's webinar is Understanding and Mitigating Cybersecurity Risks in the Solar Industry. My name is Kostis Giannakakis and I'm Project Manager at Solarplaza. A brief agenda for today. First, we're going to have a short introduction on the webinar and the panelists. After this, Tom Tansy, Chairman of Sunspec Alliance, will be the moderator for the rest of the webinar. He will set the stage for the coming hour. Afterwards, John Franzino, Director of Grid Security of GridSME, will talk about the different scenarios, regulations, and the positive effects of employing cybersecurity measures on the ROI and energy production. And last but not least, Allan Daly of NEXTracker, he's the Vice President of Software Engineering, will discuss methods for developing and implementing security in the product design. Afterwards, there will be time for Q&A. Overall, we will take approximately 1 hour. Again, my name is Kostis, Project Manager at Solarplaza. I work on the Solar Asset Management conferences in Europe and the USA. And here are my contact details. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions regarding solar asset management and our conferences. For those of you that don't know Solarplaza that well, we are a global information platform for solar PV. Our main business is organizing high-level B2B conferences and trade missions, and we have organized over 100 in the last 13 years in more than 30 countries. And we also have a network of over 60,000 solar professionals, and yeah, this is growing every day. This webinar is a pre-call to our yearly conference, Solar Asset Management North America. This is the 5th edition, and it's taking place in San Francisco on March 13 and 14th. It is North America's leading conference dedicated to the optimization of the operational phase of PV plants and portfolios. There are a lot of topics to be discussed during the conference. So from strategy to O&M, financial and technical asset management, market trends, innovative technologies, PPA, energy storage, cybersecurity, of course, and many more. These are some of the companies that will be involved in this year conference. You can see the full overview on the website. Special thanks to our sponsors, including NEXTracker and GridSME, for making this conference and content possible. If you haven't registered yet to the conference and would like to do it, we are providing today a discount, and you can use this code, webinar20, during the registration in our website, and the first 10 registrants will get a 10% discount on the conference tickets. Some practical notes. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please use the chat box. For Q&A, please also make use of the chat box, and we will address as many questions as possible after the presentations. And the presentation slides and video recordings will be available afterwards at our website, www.solarassetmanagement.us. So our first speaker and moderator for the next hour is going to be Tom Tansy of Sunspec. He leads the efforts of establishing data and communication standards, enabling the integration of solar PV and storage in the smart grid. So Tom, I'm gonna give you control of the keyboard right now, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Great, thank you, Kostis, and welcome everyone to this webinar on cybersecurity and the lead up to the Solar Asset Management North America conference. Again, my name is Tom Tansy. I'm going to make some opening comments and then moderate for our panelists here. Okay. So we have as our two panelists today, John Franzino. He's the Director of Grid Security at GridSME. He'll be the second panelist following me. And you can see his credentials here. He is an expert in the field of threat analysis and has long experience in working across the solar industry. Allan Daly, here's his picture. He's a VP of Software Engineering. He's going to talk to us about how to build in secure measures right into the equipment. So one of the questions that we often get is, Is security something that you add on, or do you build it in from the ground up? And the answer is you build it in from the ground up. And so Allan will address some of those issues. All right. So my introductory remarks are about threat assessment. And basically, since we have a lot of asset managers on this call, this is the topic of the conference, the threats that I would like to address here is really, what about the threats to your job? So what should you be thinking about to prepare yourself for a future where you have responsibility for security? Now, of course, many of you have responsibility for security right now, but what you may not know is that the scope of your involvement in this practice will definitely be growing as the industry gets larger. And so those are the things that I want to talk about. Okay, so really the first point that I'd like to make here, and this is, I think, not a well-known fact, is that security is required for all PV systems that will be installed in North America in the coming months and years, certainly. And if we're looking at the United States market as an individual market within North America, we have to pay attention to what's happening in two of the leading states in California and Hawaii. So there, the state level mandates stipulate that we're going to have secure network systems. And so this requirement is stipulated in the interconnection rules for each of these states, Rule 21 for California and Rule 14H for Hawaii. Both of these rules are in effect now. They're being rolled out, the requirements are being rolled out incrementally. And what you're going to see here in about 12 months' time is the need for networking to go on every DER system, so large or small, so from residential, commercial, industrial, etc. And of course, I'm not really mentioning within this regulation, of course, what happens in the utility scale systems where security is already a basic requirement as implemented in the NERC-CIP standards. So, but focusing a little bit on the distributed energy resources and the distribution grid, the next point to mention is that the IEEE 1547 standard, which is the national standard for governing distributed energy resources, that went in fact and that was stipulated in 2005 that IEEE would be the national standard. It's the thing that informs all the state level interconnection rules. Now, IEEE 1547 went through a process of being revised over the last couple of years, and that is culminating now in the publication of the 2018 standard. So the standard has been approved, all the comments have been resolved, and in fact the balloting has taken place and it's passed. And so what that specification mandates now is that all DER systems must support at least one standard interface as it pertains to communication. And if you're more interested in that, we can cover the specifics of that standard, but suffice it to say that we are going to have all systems connected using TCP/IP internet-based protocols and using sort of standard security mechanisms that we're used to from the private industry. So now this is interesting, but what does it mean? It means that you have to deal with a whole different set of considerations. So if you're an asset manager that's focused in on utility scale plants, and if you're operating in California, you can look up the stats. You can see that there's a total of about 720 utility scale plants that are currently connected to the wholesale market, and thus under control. Now, and of course, then all of these are fully secured. Compare that to the number of small systems that get installed in California every year, which is about 300,000. So you're talking about a scale issue that is vastly different. And so that means that you can't use the same mechanisms for the small systems as you do the large ones. You need to adapt your tactics. And so, maybe you're not involved in residential systems, but commercial industrial follows the same pattern. So if that's the situation, maybe we're not talking about hundreds of thousands, but merely thousands. But the point is the scale differences are pretty large. The second issue is, of course, within the distribution grid versus utility scale is you have local control versus remote control. The C&I plants, residential plants, they're unmanned, and so you have to both network them and secure them, operate them, and manage them all from afar. And so that's a big consideration. And then finally, the regulations. So within the utility scale, NERC-CIP is the dominant standard, and our other panelists are going to go into that in detail. And in the distribution grid, you have primarily state interconnection rules. Now, as the distribution grid marketplace grows up and we start to see aggregated C&I systems or aggregated residential systems, those systems in aggregate can reach the threshold where they too are governed by NERC and CIP. So you have an evolving story as it pertains to security of solar plants and storage plants of various sizes. So those are some of the things that you should be concerned with. So then, why worry about small systems at all? Some people might say they're so small. If we lose one, if we lose two, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that they are unmanned. They are built in such a way that they have to be operated from afar, and so the security and network solutions have to match that. The problem with that is if you have the opportunity to crack one of these small systems, you have the potential for a class break, which could then have the same sort of a damaging effect as if you were to take down, one or more large plants. And so that's why we worry about small systems. The same way that we don't just worry about mainframe computers, we worry about mobile devices and PCs. I mean, that same phenomenon is at play here when we're talking about networking and securing distributed energy or PV or storage plants. So some considerations for you as an asset manager, looking at risk management, you need to be thinking about a proportional response. All threats are not the same, certainly, and in every response have a cost. So these are some of the trade-offs you'll have to make. On the regulatory front, the rules are going to differ by system size, and as your portfolio grows up within the small systems, well, then you may be subject to the same rules that the larger systems are. When it comes to equipment, you want products that work out of the box. Now, I would say that this statement that you want to build in your security solutions and your networking solutions right into the foundation of how you're building your system. And I think that comment goes for utility scale on down to residential. It becomes an even more acute concern, I think, with the residential systems because of that unmanned aspect. But nonetheless, that is a key concern that you should be thinking about. On the finance sides, you should think about budgets that scale. When we talk about putting together a system for utility scale, we're talking about a networking and security budget that is measured in thousands. And when we're talking about residential, we're talking about solutions that are measured in pennies. So pennies are maybe a few dollars. And so very, very different type of situation. Of course, that it all sort of comes out in the wash because you've got a lot more of the smaller systems, but you need to be thinking about that issue. And then finally on personnel, training and record keeping, there's requirements across the board here, and many of the procedures are going to be the same. Some are different. Now, of course, when it comes to the personnel aspect, making sure that you have the requisite skill set within your series of service providers is certainly a very important issue, particularly at this time when we're in an inflection point. We're going from the networking and security being predominant at the utility scale and certainly used at C&I and residential, but not quite in the same rigorous way. And so everybody's sort of upping their game, and that includes on the personnel and the training and record keeping. So those are the things that I'm going to ask for you to think about as we go through this presentation and as you think about your job over the coming year. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn over the microphone to my colleague, John Franzino, who's going to take us through again, the sort of a threat assessment, and how do you consider operating on utility scale plants. So John, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Tom. This is John Franzino. Good morning, everyone. As previously mentioned, I'm the Director of Grid Security at GridSME. So as Tom alluded to, my day-to-day job is really focused at the utility scale, both for the solar sites themselves as well as control centers that control those sites remotely. So as part of my day-to-day job, I both monitor and manage the SCADA infrastructure at these sites and control centers from a security perspective. So what I want to go through today is a little bit of overlap with, going through why cybersecurity is applicable to everyone of all shapes and sizes. And I think Tom already alluded to and did a great job of that intro from the DG perspective, and I'll kind of build on that and work our way up to utility scale. But just know that as we go through this, threat assessment and talk about, what is applicable to these different environments at the utility scale, the same type of concepts and the same issues are applicable across the board at DG. And as Tom said again, it's just a matter of scaling up or down, given your size of your system, your budget, the impact, and just taking a good risk-based approach to approaching cybersecurity. So with that said, we'll just dive right in here. I'm not going to harp on this one at all because hopefully this one's already painfully obvious to everyone. But the fact of the matter is that cybersecurity threats are alive and well out there. We can see very, very clearly through the many vulnerability disclosure feeds that are out there, the Department of Homeland Security, and many of these other entities and reporting agencies that do a great job at highlighting the fact that these threats are real. And, of course, some of them are sensationalized and dramatized. But at the end of the day, the amount of threats and the sophistication of these threats are definitely increasing hand over fist. There's no doubt about that year to year. So with that said, our work is cut out for us. So I'm hopefully not going to, I don't need to harp on, that the threat is alive and well. But what I do want to focus on is how that threat is applicable to you. Because we've all heard it before, the fact that I am too small, or I'm not a target. Whatever variation that we want to talk about, I think we've all heard that before. So again, as I said, because we do perform hands-on managed services for many different solar sites and control centers, I do want to show you some real-life examples that we've seen over the course of business. These are all screenshots from the last about 4 months or so of real-life threats we're seeing out there. And just want to talk about why nobody is quote unquote too small. And again, I think Tom did a good job leading in there. So if your solar site's connected to the internet, I hate to break it to you, but you are subject to what's known as internet weather. Internet weather is essentially all, if you ever heard of a botnet army or bot, but it's all this activity, nefarious activity that goes out on the internet. There are automated bots, there are automated tools that are scanning the internet for internet-facing devices, vulnerable servers, vulnerable workstations, whatever it may be. You may have heard of Shodan and others. There's many tools out there that you do not need to be a computer expert to utilize and really start to enumerate what is out there on the internet. Of course, the Internet of Things, the IoT world that's exploding, that's really filling up Shodan's database right now. There's a ton of things sitting on the internet. So on the left here, you can see a screenshot from our security event and log management system. And this is a log shown from one of the solar sites we manage and the internet-facing firewall. This internet-facing firewall throughout the middle of the night on May 25th was just being repeatedly attempted to log in by a bot. You can see they start with root, they try 3 times with default credentials. They move on then to admin. And now if I could show you the whole laundry list of this log, you're going to see them throughout the course of the night start working their way through the alphabet, basically common default username, starting with A, going all the way down. Within about 10 hours overnight, they got, I think, through their dictionary to about the letter E or so. Point being is that there is just continuous activity out there. It's not humans. You don't need a live human being sitting behind the computer. This is at huge scale. These bots are out there trying to log in with default passwords and credentials all day long. We see it all day. Most firewalls are dropping it right away. It's a known bad IP and things like that. But once in a while, they actually do hit that interface and are trying to log in. So hopefully that's starting to enumerate why, if you're connected to the internet, there is no excuse that you're too small. these bots don't know what you are. All they see is an internet-connected device, and they're going to try to get into it. Once they find, are able to get into it, maybe that's when it's handed off to a human, and now we can start, working down that scenario. On the right is the typical WannaCry ransomware screenshot. The reason I bring this one up is within just the last 6 months, I know of 2 solar facilities that have been hit with ransomware. Again, this is an untargeted, blanketed type of attempt, and a nefarious activity that it's not that you're a direct target, it's just that you're a target of opportunity. So that's because these solar sites and had infrastructure sitting on the internet, they weren't well secured. They just got hit with ransomware, and now these solar asset owners had a decision to make. Do we, just wipe all, not worry about our data, rebuild from scratch? Do we pay the ransom? All those fun things that come along with that. Moral of that story is that, let's say 2 to 5 hours up front of a little bit of configuration work would have prevented all of these ransomware attacks that I've seen. And on the back end, since they didn't do that work up front, we're now seeing a lot of more manpower, hours, and money spent cleaning up this issue. So as always, it's always better to put a little bit of effort up front than trying to go back and clean up work. All right, so the second category, we talked about just being blanketed, targets of opportunity. Unfortunately, and that's for the internet-facing system. Now, unfortunately, if your solar facility is also connected to the electric grid, which we're going to go ahead and assume that all are, we're now also a direct target. And over the last 2-3 years, we've really seen an increase in nation-state actors, particularly what we think is looking like Russia, as well as North Korea. There's a lot of indicators of compromise that keep popping up, and for the large utilities and other organizations, that it looks like these nation states are in their corporate environments already, and they're trying to figure out how to poke around and make it to their control environment. So we have to worry about 2 sides of the coin here as being solar asset owners and operators. Is that one, we got to protect ourselves from those blanketed attempts just by being connected to the internet. That's the easy stuff. That's the basics. Once you take care of the basics, now we start thinking about, okay, what about these targeted attempts? And of course, targeted attempts are more likely to be for those concentrated assets, such as control centers, right? That's where we're really more worried about the targeted attempts. And so that's where maybe you don't implement all the security controls at a DG site that you would at a control center because of that increased risk and threat. This is just another one, just a screenshot of a real-life example to really just hope to show you guys, that this is happening in real time all day long. This is just a graph from one of the firewalls we manage. You can see in the course of a minute, we really have, about 15 scan attempts. Again, that's those bots out there, just looking at what's available on the internet and seeing what they can get into. But of course, as Tom alluded to, we can't protect everything. We can't do everything, and there's got to be a risk-based approach. And then there's also business constraints and opportunities. We got to look at cybersecurity as just another form of risk management. And historically, one of the easiest and most preferred way of risk management is to transfer that risk, right? So we either transfer risk through contractual agreements with our third-party vendors, or we do so in the form of insurance. For better or for worse, right now, while cyber insurance is becoming an insurance product that's available, it's still pretty in its infancy and not really well understood or well quantified. And that's on both sides of the table. So from the insurer's perspective, they're really having a tough time pricing that product, and you're going to see wide variations in the cost of that type of insurance because it's still an unknown to them. Any risk like that, an unknown that they can't manage, of course, is going to have a higher dollar value associated with it. On the other side of the table, from an asset owner's perspective in cybersecurity insurance, is when there is a breach or when there is a true incident that you need to report a claim against that insurance product. We really haven't had enough instances of those yet to figure out how valuable to the asset owners is that insurance going to be. Are they going to really pay full out, or is it going to be, you guys were at fault for this, and that? So moral of that story is that, yes, cyber insurance is definitely something that should be looked at and considered, but it's certainly not a full risk mitigation avenue right now, or vehicle. It may become a better vehicle in the future, as and the insurance market matures around this area. But right now, it's more of a gamble and a third, fourth layer of risk mitigation, not your primary. Turning back to the contractual way of transferring risk, I just want to touch on and really harp on, from what I've personally seen in O&M agreements throughout these last few years, is that O&M agreements are completely silent on the network management and network security that are associated with these plants. They cover a lot of other things like panel washing and weed abatement in glorious detail, but usually there's not a single sentence on what do we do about network management and how do we take care of that. So that's something that going forward, asset owners and operators really need to get a hold of and include this up front, so that it's not a big gap, because I'm seeing this between owners and operators. I thought you were doing this. No, you're doing this. Kind of game getting played right now, and it's not fun from either side of the table. So making sure that it's clear what roles and responsibilities are present at these facilities from a network management and overall cybersecurity management perspective is going to be super important going forward, so that we don't have these kind of he said, she said issues that I'm seeing now. And then again, it's all back to risk management. So we got to tailor the controls and the solutions we're going to put in place to what is that return on investment, what is the risk we're mitigating, what's the potential impact of that risk if it's realized, and what is the appropriate level of control to implement for that risk. And we even talk about any of the ancillary kind of impacts, if you will, such as reputational risk. Start with the financial risk. It's usually much easier to quantify, understand, what is the cost of system downtime. And I really don't want to focus too much on, the annual loss expenses expectancy. That is a pretty well understood and known formula to kind of quantify different types of risk. However, because cybersecurity breaches are still sort of a nebulous and not really well understood in terms of the likelihood and probability, I don't want to spend much time there. But what I do want to focus on is how to forget about this nebulous, okay, if we had a breach, what's the cost of that? Because that's looking on a larger time scale. What the likelihood of that happening, on the more 10-year time scale, where most of people's budgets, for these projects in an O&M fashion are looking at those yearly time scales. So just using a quick example here and trying to put this in perspective from a risk management take is, if you say we have a PPA price of $40 a megawatt hour, which is pretty conservative, although unfortunately for a lot of you guys out there, I've been seeing some lower numbers in recent times. And we use a nice, round 100 megawatt nameplate with a 25% capacity factor. What is the cost of system downtime? This is why I want to harp on this, is because cybersecurity doesn't only give you, protection from those security breaches, but it also gives you operational benefits. I mean, if we have you guys are studying and know what the module failure rate is of these facilities, but what happens when a SCADA server fails? What happens when the core infrastructure that facility aggregates to and is controlled by fails? Is there a plan in place to recover that SCADA server? How long is it going to take you to recover that server? Is it going to be 4 hours of downtime? Is it going to be a day of downtime? Do you have even backups of the existing configuration for files? All those kind of considerations that I think where cybersecurity sometimes is looked at a cost center currently by executives. But so that's my recommendation as asset owners and operators, is really to try to move away from this the traumatized, we're going to have a cyber breach to justify budgets for cybersecurity, but take a more practical look at it and say, from an operational standpoint, how do we save money here? And start looking at some of these hardware failure rates that may be present in your SCADA servers and study those like you're studying the module failure rates, because at the end of the day, that server affects the production of the whole facility, while the module is only just one very tiny piece. So I just want to make sure that the attention is given to where the greatest impact and return on investment for that attention is possible. And I believe that's, in the substation for these utility scale projects, focusing on that core network infrastructure. So we're not going to be able to get to the real solutions here. So sorry, I apologize. This is more just a problem statement for today. But, during the conference, obviously, we'll get into much more of the details about, okay, we understand there's a problem, but how do I actually start to tactically address this problem? Right now, we're still at the strategy level, if you will. So there's a ton of frameworks out there for cybersecurity. Some are better than others, in my opinion. Obviously, NERC-CIP is one that some of you may have responsibilities at your facilities for, or at your control centers. There is also NIST 800-53, which is a very detailed, very well thought out framework, almost daunting, if you will, a little too thought out sometimes. But there's a great table, attachment G, I believe, in the back, that lays out all these good security control activities to meet these different types of domain areas like access management and configuration management. So my recommendation, if you're looking for good ideas about what kind of controls are well suited to mitigate different threats, that's a great resource to go steal some good ideas from that table. And then last but not least is the top 20 critical security controls. This one is one of my favorites just because it's very easy to understand. It's prioritized 1 through 20. So, maybe for the DG sites, we're only talking about doing 1 through 5 in a limited fashion. Whereas if we're talking a very large control center, you might go all the way through the gamut. So that one's very easy to understand. It's a good way to rate yourself too in a scorecard fashion, just because of its simplicity. And then of course, within those different 20 areas, you can dive as deep as you need to, and then pull from other frameworks to fill in any gaps. So I'm sorry I had to do it. I do deal with NERC-CIP a lot as part of my day-to-day, both at these solar facilities, which are, sometimes low impact from the NERC-CIP standards perspective, and then also at control centers for medium impact. Just have to say it out loud that, compliance in general, but especially NERC-CIP, is meant to be the floor and not the ceiling. This is especially true at the site level for low impact CIP. The actual requirements for cybersecurity and physical security for low impact CIP is pretty low. Let's just put it that way. So I just want to make sure that nobody is getting confused that by complying with these low impact standards, you've now mitigated your cybersecurity risk. Because for better or for worse, that's just simply not true. So use these as guiding frameworks, use it as what the bare minimum is, but then look to implement best practices as it makes sense for your environment and it makes sense based on your risk-based decisions and analysis.
Great, John. Thank you so much for that. So to our audience, please, if you have questions for John or any of our other participants here, please do put your questions in the chat box and we'll get to them in due course. So with that, I think I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Allan Daly, Vice President of Engineering at NEXTracker, who's going to talk about security features that can be built in to the system from the ground up. So Allan, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tom and John. Nice to meet everybody. Thank you, Costas and Solarplaza, for inviting us to participate today. So great. It's been really interesting so far, right? We really understand that these threats are real, and maybe even are a little bit scared about this stuff, as we should be. That the world is a little bit complex and scary in this regard. And I have the nice position today of getting to talk about what are some possible solutions to this important threat that we're facing. So my idea today is to talk through, we're a product manufacturer. At NEXTracker, we manufacture tracker systems, but I'm going to try not to take and just talk about what we're doing, but talk about it in more generally about what are some systematic kinds of solutions that can be applied to these problems to hopefully inform and generate some discussion with the audience members today. So I'd like to make the assertion off the top here that this is definitely, no doubt about it, the kind of problem that we can address. And although the world is scary, by being smart about it, we really do have the ability to do this correctly. And I like to think about cybersecurity as lots of little things. It's not the solution that you can just go buy one big cybersecurity solution and stamp it onto your project and you're done. This is a kind of a solution that is about lots of little things. You even got a sense from John's presentation a second ago. We've got checklists and standards and section 1, 2, 3, and 4. By carefully planning and then implementing many little elements of a system, you do end up with the ability to create secure systems at scale and then garner all the value of having that connectivity. And just a couple of quotes here from many more famous people than me, validating that little things are important in life. I'm sure we all know that. So what I'd like to do here is show the vision. Where are we going? You always need to balance these threats and the cost of doing this work with the benefits. And this vision here is one of a connected power plant, solar power plant, that enables any kind of remote services, whether they be from O&M providers or from manufacturers, or even as yet unidentified services that can use data and deliver control remotely and securely to power plants all over the world to create additional value on top of the investments that owners have already made in these extremely valuable assets. So the vision here is to be able to connect all sorts of different systems and components on the ground, use the existing data infrastructure at a power plant, connect it to a secure bi-directional data pipeline, and then link to a whole variety of secure data centers that are providing remote services for those plants. This is a very modern IoT kind of a goal picture that we're showing here, and this is definitely achievable by being smart about the way we implement secure services. I wanted to put in one slide here to just show what our context is here at NEXTracker, and give you just a sense, because as I talk about these solutions, I hope it's useful to understand a little bit what our perspective is on the world. We've got 11 gigawatts of trackers out there in the world that we're connected to and talking to that have either been delivered or in construction now. Very large fleet, and our goals there at the bottom probably are the most important. It is our goal as a product manufacturer to connect to and acquire data from every component of every system we're out there have provided in the world every 5 minutes. Bring that data back together and create meaningful value for our customers with that data. We've seen this play out many, many times, and this model of connecting securely, using that data to provide and create value is one that can apply to any system, not just ours. So that's the vision we're going for. So I wanted to then immediately come back down to ground and say, we deal with security every single day here at NEXTracker. And I've been here for over a couple of years now. When I first came here, even just that short of a time ago, security was something that was very important, but honestly wasn't something we were dealing with every single day. I would say that in the last 6 months, kind of following on Tom and John's comments, this is a concern that has really bubbled to the top. And there's not a day that goes by in our office where me and my team are not thinking about security, talking with customers about security, and dealing with security design in our systems. And so these are a few of the kinds of questions that we get all the time. And then I'm going to talk through some case studies here in the next couple of slides about how these questions get answered. So how do you handle product level security? Number one. How do you protect power plants if there are hackers out there trying to get in, if you give people remote access? What protocols do you use? How do you use the data? What data do you use? What platforms are your SCADA systems and your dashboards built on? How do you handle patch management and configuration management and virus management on all of your systems? How do you vet technicians and operators? Background checks? What data policies are in place? Hopefully these are just the exact same kind of questions that the attendees of this webinar are having in their mind as well. And I'll try to do my best here to address these in the next couple of case studies. Okay, so here is a diagram of a CNI type of a project, sometimes called DG or distributed generation, more of a medium-sized project, maybe 0.5 megawatt to maybe 5 megawatts, maybe even 10 these days. So maybe one that's not quite as large as a utility scale project that would really trigger all of the NERC-CIP heavy-duty requirements. But more and more we see these out in the world. And in our portfolio, we have a number of these kinds of projects. And I'll just talk through this kind of piece by piece. So doing a secure product plan and a secure system plan involves having a very clear set of boundaries and connections and access points that I'm starting to describe in this diagram. So down here at the plant level, we think about there being this boundary, a cybersecurity boundary that's been defined around the plant, and that is protected from the outside world, or access is created to the outside world using a firewall. The same kind of security boundary exists over here at any kind of remote operation center that might be connecting into the plant with the firewall as well. And then these two devices essentially can create a secure connection between the two. So you'll see here we've got our assets, we've got our remote operators, and these dashed lines show the different security boundaries that are created to enable this secure bidirectional data connection to occur. And you've then got different measures that are in place in the different places around access control, incident response, patch management, virus management, access logging in the remote center. In the power plant, you've got products that are encrypted. Their communication is encrypted. Again, you've got authorization and authentication as part of that, and configuration management, patch management. What I mean by that is, getting firmware upgrades out to devices that are running embedded firmware as new security threats are identified and dealt with in a proactive way before they become issues. And then lastly, here in the middle, this secure bidirectional connector also involves the use of encryption, authentication, and authorization. So to get back to the questions, how do you handle security in the products themselves? So down here, communication and access is done with encryption and using valid security credentials to allow only the correct people to access the systems. How do you protect power plants? These boundaries, these dashed lines, create secure boundaries, and the firewalls end up being correct, secure ways to allow those connections to happen, to enforce only the correct people to be authorized. What protocols do you use? We use regular ZigBee encryption, AES 128 and 256-bit encryption, depending on the different products and availability. The SCADA platforms are built with oftentimes industrial strength Linux builds that also allow all the same kind of transport layer security and encryption to happen. Patch management, we talked about that a little bit already. And when it comes to vetting of personnel, there's a whole series that can be implemented around badges and access codes, et cetera, as is appropriate for the different levels. So even at this DG level, by implementing a whole series of measures that each one of themselves is not that complicated, together you then build a secure chain that allows this secure bidirectional connectivity to occur. I'm going to go up now a level of complexity and look at a utility scale project where NERC-CIP or other security measures might be mandated, not just voluntary at this point. And you can see this diagram is very similar to the last, although we've added in this whole remote data center here in the middle. And this data center becomes a cybersecure platform that can mediate communications between the remote NOC and the power plant in a way that is powerful. And the biggest difference here is that as we've now gone up a level of complexity from a smaller plant to a larger plant, we are trying to build in security to the products in order to make the process of assembling this large chain of small elements easier and more robust and more reliable and more bulletproof. So this is really a IoT type of a model that many of you are probably starting to hear about. What's happening here is that in these smart devices in the field, there are agents, secure agents built in that can connect only to well-known, well-defined data centers up here. So the primary data flow is between these secure agents in this IoT mode between the devices and the data center. And then the remote network operating center connects into this data center in a secure way so that you've got a disaggregation of access to data collection. And using that same model as before, I'm starting to list out in red all the different individual elements that are occurring at each of these different pieces in the puzzle. Each one individually is not that complicated, but putting them together in this well-orchestrated concert becomes a very, a task of implementation and planning to make sure it's all carried out correctly. So we definitely want to leave some time for questions. So I'm not going to go too much into more detail here. And in fact, Kostas, can you bring up the polling question at this point that we put together ahead of time that just asks about IT capabilities?
Coming up, Allan.
Is that possible now? Great, thank you. So the question here was, given my background that I just presented in these two different case studies, do you feel that the IT expertise that attendees are seeing out there in the world at the CNI level and then at the utility scale level are up to this challenge? Like what's the state of the world right now? That's the goal of this polling question, just to take your temperature on that topic. Okay, interesting. So the idea here is that we're seeing, for CNI projects, roughly 2/3 of the attendees believe that maybe it's a little bit too low right now at the CNI level to really implement this kind of stack of small measures all correctly. And very interestingly, even at the utility scale level, maybe even half of the utility scale plants that people have experience with are on the low end of what's out there. So this really, in numbers, maybe identifies a gap we all kind of feel ourselves, that there is going to be some need to bring people forward and educate on this topic. Okay, Kostas, do you mind flipping back? I have just one more here, guys, and then we'll get to the Q&A section. I'm not sure. Can you advance that for me? Kostas, okay, perfect, thank you. Last thing I wanted to point out was that it's not a set it and forget it kind of a world we're in when it comes to this security. There's a number of recurring tasks. Again, keeping these small things, lots of little balls in the air, that really is what this is all about. And this just gives a quick list of some typical tasks that we do in our systems that may be appropriate for you guys to do in your systems. And there's a cadence. These things need to be done annually. These things need to be done monthly, keeping the whole system fresh and appropriate as we proceed. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I'll send it back over to Tom to moderate any further questions or discussion at this point.
Great, thank you, Allan. Appreciate that. Again, great comments. Well, so to kick this off, I'll start with you, Allan, and John. I'll ask you the same question. Put it back to you for the polling question. What are you finding in the field there? Are you finding that the level of preparedness is adequate? Is the competence level right? And then related to that, is this a problem? I mean, in other words, can asset managers simply outsource their problem to someone else? So it's a complex question, but let's start first. So first of all, what's the level of preparedness and competence that you're finding within the marketplace that you're dealing with? So Allan, how about for you?
Sure. It's mixed. You know, my experience is very much aligned with what the folks on the call wrote. You know, some people are relatively naive when it comes to these things, and some people are quite sophisticated. That said, everybody has been capable to be able to implement what we're talking about. So with the right level of education and dialogue, there's not a site yet that we haven't been able to work through correctly the different security issues, get things put in place. Every customer is different too in terms of what their requirements are. So there's, at this point in our state of affairs, we need to have flexibility and understanding and a little bit of time and effort to get each one set up, but you always can accomplish it. So mixed, but I'm still optimistic it can come together.
Yeah, John, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with the poll question, but I'll make a general statement overall. First and foremost is that regardless of the industry, there is a shortage currently in cybersecurity skill sets and knowledge. So that's just, that is not something that's isolated in the solar industry. That's something that is seen across the board right now, just as by the number of cybersecurity related jobs open. So if there's kids out there going to school for that, maybe it's a good idea for a future career. With that said, what I am seeing for sure, regardless of the current state, is that owners and operators are starting to get much more savvy about what the requirements are and how to approach cybersecurity. So a few years ago, we saw where basically no one had really any strong opinions on how things need to be done. These requirements that Alan mentioned maybe didn't even exist yet. And now I'm starting to see owners come forth with pretty good requirement sets and lists. So making sure that, you know, if you're on the product delivery or integration end, being able to match up with those requirements is definitely very important.
All right, very good. So related question to this is that, you know, if an asset management firm doesn't have the expertise, is it feasible to outsource this security function to others? And if so, what would be required to do so?
Well, I guess that's an easy one for me to answer because I do provide that service. My group does provide that type of service for different asset owners, operators, and managers. So it is possible to outsource, and you know we're seeing this in a lot of different industries too because this is specialized skill set and requires a lot of deep background and technical knowledge. A lot of other industries have already gone the route of managed services, managed security services providers, MSSP. Healthcare is doing it a lot. So it just really comes down to what you think your core business is and what you want to get into. So I mean, if you're going to start doing these services yourself, you can definitely do that. Just be prepared, you know, to invest the time, energy, and resources that's necessary to do this job well.
Okay. And Alan, a question for you. So let's say that a company takes that approach that they want to outsource the function. So is it too late at that point? In other words, I think that there's one of the sort of the adages in security is you sort of want to build it in. So if you're outsourcing it, you know, what are the special risks that you would have in that scenario, and how do you mitigate them?
Yeah, great question. Like I said before, I really am optimistic that we can create systems, even for deployed systems that are out there right now, with the right help and the right plan, you can secure them and you can get them implemented in a way that's correct. You know, the real world is just an ugly place sometimes. It's very heterogeneous. Every site is different. Every project is different. You know, sometimes they call these things, you know, snowflakes, right? Every site is different. Every project is different. So you do need to work with professionals if that's the route you're going to choose, or have your own staff really understand what you've got. I liked John's that list, that top 20 list there. Start at the top, number one, you know, and just start working through and learn, assess, implement, and work your way through that. There's great resources out there, and I think it's definitely possible to build it in, to lay it on top.
Yeah, Alan, you bring up a great point. And of course, it's ideal to integrate security from the get-go, but like you said, we don't necessarily live in an ideal world. But you also touched on another very important subject, and that's everything is different. And one of the things I've continuously seen the last few years in working intimately with this project is that lots of EPCs are taking a templated approach to every project. They implement something that worked on Project A a few years ago, and Project A works. So that now becomes their template, and they just blanketly apply that across the board. And it does it without any real critical thinking about, does this make sense for this scenario? Is there a way to improve this and do this more efficiently? So our message is there is constantly look at your template of designs and constantly refine them. Just because something worked once and was good enough once doesn't mean that's what should be implemented every time thereafter.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from the audience from Amanda Bybee, who says, it's clear to me that if a bad actor gained access to the equipment, they could shut it down. And that would result in financial harm to the asset owner from lost production, or that their own data could be taken hostage with ransomware. But she's unclear on the threat to the industry and what harm could come to the grid at large.
Well, I can definitely touch on that one. And so the grid at large and all these reliability standards, I actually just gave a punchline. So all these, CIP standards and the other standards we have about how do you operate the local electric system, the grid, is all about the reliability of the grid. And what that comes down to basically is making sure that we have enough generation at any given second to match our load. And it's a constant balancing act. But when a bad actor can do, whether we're talking about a few large plants or a fleet of smaller plants, is they can disrupt that balance. There's control room operators out there that are keeping everything in balance. They have a bunch of megawatts, a bunch of solar plants go offline, or even worse, maybe sit on and off. They're going to have a large system disturbance to deal with. That system disturbance, if not mitigated correctly in a timely fashion, that's going to result in a rolling blackout, which, and then in the worst case scenario is we have large transformers being damaged. That's the more serious scenario, less likely, but more impactful. And that's, if you're able to flip on and off this equipment to the point of damaging some of these large transmission transformers out there, those lead times on those pieces of equipment, are months, 6 months to a year. So making sure that equipment isn't damaged, that could result in long outages, or we can have short outages from system imbalances.
Right. So I'd like to add to that, again, to provide a sort of a DG perspective. What the states, the public utility commissions in California and Hawaii in particular are concerned about, and why security is important, is that with the introduction, the reason that smart inverters were introduced is that the tolerance windows were insufficient, and so you have some grid imbalances, and pretty soon these inverters start tripping off. And so when a system trips off, that's as bad as a big power sucking plant turning on. It causes, it wreaks havoc in the system and can cause these sort of rolling blackouts. And so seemingly sort of innocuous acts like curtailing a small system, if done in the proper scale, can knock out a neighborhood, a substation, or potentially a region. And so that's why I think there's so much emphasis in the distribution grid about building in some basic security measures really from the start. Okay, so then the next question that I have is that is there a proper level of dialogue that's taking place between the system owners and their counterparties? So in other words, is there an open channel of communication so that people can discuss and understand the priorities of the system operators or the utilities themselves? Or is that even a concern, or something that we should not worry about? Are the regulations good enough?
Tom, I think the dialogue is increasing. I think the dialogue is still limited. And I think, when we're talking about that dialogue between the asset owners and the asset operators and maintainers, I think part of the crux of that issue and the lack of dialogue currently, although the dialogue is increasing definitely, is due to what I mentioned earlier in my presentation, just the silence that these O&M existing, past O&M contracts have on this type of activity in cybersecurity in general. I think moving forward, as long as we understand, capture that up front in the contracts for roles and responsibilities, obviously that's going to help create the dialogue and keep things moving forward. So it's happening slowly but surely, but it's a lot of work to go back into a contract that is silent and then create dialogue around that topic.
All right. Well, speaking of dialogue, we want to keep it going, but we're kind of pretty much out of time here. So with that, I want to turn it over to Kostis, and I want to encourage everybody in the audience here to come and engage with dialogue with our panelists here, John Franzino from GridSME and Allan Daly of NEXTracker. I think both these gentlemen will be at Solar Asset Management North America. So with Kostis, I'll turn it back over to you to take it home.
All right. Thank you very much, Tom, John, and Allan, for this very interesting input. I think indeed it's a challenge that not a lot of people are thinking about, and it's our job to indeed talk more about this. Also, many thanks to our attendees for their input and participation. I hope this webinar was of value to you. And if you have any questions or remarks, please feel free to reach out to me at kostis@solarplaza.com or reach out also to our speakers. And of course, we hope to meet you at our conference in San Francisco or at any other of our upcoming Solar Plaza conferences. For example, Japan or Mexico are two of the upcoming ones. So I wish you all a great day and look forward to meeting you in San Francisco. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joseph. Take care, everyone.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.